I'm going to read to you from Ross Poldark, and it will be chapter 6 from chapter 6, which is the seduction scene between Ross and Demelza, and it's from my copy here by Winston, Ross Poldark and Demelza. The frock was one she had found at the bottom of the second tin trunk, and from the outset it had enticed her as the apple did Eve. It was made of pale blue satin, the bodice cut low and square. Below the tight waist the gown billowed out at the back like a beautiful blue cabbage. She thought it an evening gown, but really it was one Grace Poldark had bought for a formal afternoon. It was the right length for Demelza, and other alterations she had contrived on wet afternoons. There was a thrill in trying it on, even though no one would ever see her wear it. But now she peered at herself in the half-light and tried to see. Her hair she had combed up and parted at the side and drawn away from the ears to pile it on top of her head. At any other time she would have been pleased with her looks and preened herself, walking up and down peacock fashion to hear the woof, ruff of the silk. But now she stared and wondered and stared. She had no powder, as a real lady would have, no rouge, no scent. She bit her lips to redden them. And this bodice, Ross's mother, might have been made different, or perhaps she had worn a muslin fichu. She knew that if the widow Chegwidden saw her, she would open her tight little mouth and scream the word Babylon. She wondered what Ross would say. She stiffened. She had set to go. There was no more to do, no drawing back. The flint and steel were clumsy in her hands, and she was hard put to it to light the candle. At last a flame flickered, and the rich blueness of the gown showed up more vividly. She rustled as she moved to the door, then slowly, candlestick in hand, went down the stairs. At the door of the parlour she paused, swallowed something foreign in her throat, licked her lips, and went in. He had finished his meal and was seated in the half-darkness in front of the empty fire grate. His hands were in his pockets and his head was down. He moved slightly at her entry, but did not look up. "I've bought the light," she said, speaking in a voice unlike her own, but he didn't notice. Slowly she walked round, conscious of the noise her skirt was making, lit the 2 candle sconces. With each candle she lit, the room grew a shade lighter, the squares of the windows a shade darker. All the sky over the hill was ice blue, bright and clear, and empty as a frozen pool. He stirred again and sat more upright in his chair. His voice came as a shock to her ears. "You heard that Jim Carter has gone to prison for 2 years. She lit the candle. "Yes." "I doubt if he'll survive." "You did all you could." "I wonder." He spoke as if he were talking to himself rather than to her. She began to draw the curtains over the open windows. "What else could you have done?" "I'm not a good pleader," he said, being too infernal conscious of my own dignity. "The dignified fool Demelza gets nowhere besides the suave, flattering rogue. Gentle, obsequious compliments were the order of the day, and instead I tried to teach them their business, a lesson in tactics, but Jim Carter may pay the bill with his life." She pulled the last curtain. A moth came fluttering in, wings beating the green-figured damask. "No one else had done what you did," she said, "no other squire. It was none of your fault that he went a-poaching, and he was caught." Ross grunted. To be frank, I don't think my interference greatly altered the situation. But that is no matter, for... He stopped. He stared. This was the moment. Now. I haven't bought the other candles, she got out. We were short, and you said you'd get some today. Have you been drinking again? She said desperately. I never touched nothing since you told me. Honest, I swear to God. Where did you get that dress? From the library. Her ready lies were forgotten. So now you wear my mother's clothes. She stammered. You never told me that. You never told me that I mustn't drink, and I've never touched nothing since. You never told me not to touch the clothes. I tell you now, go and take those things off. It couldn't have been worse, but in the depths of horror and despair one comes to a new steadiness. There is no farther to fall. She moved a foot or two into the yellow gleam of the candlelight. Well, don't you like it? He stared at her again. I've told you what I think. She came to the end of the table, and the moth fluttered past the candles and across the blue of her dress, and patted its reckless wings against the cupboard by the wall. Can I not sit and talk for a while? Astounding the change, the hair combed up gave her face an altered and more oval shape. Her youthful features were clean-cut and wholesome. Her look was adult. He felt like someone who had adopted a tiger cub without knowing what it would grow into. The imp of a sturdy disrespect for his own position tempted him to laugh. But the incident wasn't funny. If it had been, he would have laughed with a clear mind. He didn't know why it wasn't funny. He said in a withdrawn voice, You came here as a maid, and have been a good one. For that you've been allowed certain liberties, but the liberty of dressing yourself in those things is not one of them. The chair on which he had been sitting at the table was still half out, and she subsided on the edge of it. She smiled nervously, but with more brilliance than she thought. Please, Ross, can't I stay? No one'll ever know, please. Words bubbled to her lips, overflowed in a whisper. I aren't doing no harm. 'Tis no more'n I've done many and many an evening afore. I didn't mean no harm putting on these clothes. They was rotten away in an old tin box. It just seems shame to leave all these pretty things there rotten away. I only meant it to please you. I thought you'd maybe like it. If I stay here now, till 'tis time to go. He said, Get off to bed at once, and we'll say no more of it. I'm 17, she said mutinously. I've been 17 for weeks. Are he always going to treat me like a child? I'll not be treated like a child. I'm a woman now. Can I not please myself when I do go to bed? You can't please yourself how you behave. I thought you liked me. So I do, but not to let you rule the house. I don't want to rule the house, Ross. I only want to sit here and talk to you. I've only old clothes to work in. This is so... To have something like this on, do as I say, or you'll go home to your father in the morning. From the first desperately shy beginning, she had succeeded in working up a feeling of grievance against him. For the moment she really believed that the issue was whether she should be given certain privileges. Well then, she said, turn me out tonight. I don't care. Hit me if you want to, like father used to. I'll get drunk and shout the house down, and then you'll have good reason. She turned and picked up the glass from the table. She poured out some brandy and took a gulp of it. Then she waited to see what effect it would have on him. He quickly leaned forward and picked up the wooden poker and rapped her sharply across the knuckles with it, so that the glass broke and spilled its contents down the disputed frock. For a moment she looked more surprised than hurt. Then she put her knuckles into her mouth. The mature and defiant 17 became a desolate and unfairly rebuked child. She stared down at the frock where the brandy was soaking through the skirt. Tears came into her eyes, beading upon her thick dark lashes, till she blinked them away, beading again and trembling at the rim without falling. Her attempt at coquetry had been a painful failure. but nature was coming to her help. I shouldn't have done that," he said. He didn't know why he had spoken, or why he should apologize for a just and necessary rebuke. Quicksands had moved under his feet. "The frock," she said. "You shouldn't have spoiled the frock. It was that pretty. I'll go home tomorrow. I'll go as soon as the light comes." She got up from the chair, tried to say something more. Then suddenly he was kneeling by the chair, her head on his knees, sobbing. He looked down at her, at the head with its tumble of dark hair beginning to come awry, at the gleam of her neck. He touched her hair with its light and dark shadows. "You little," he said, "stay on if you want to." She tried to dry her eyes, but they kept filling up again. For the first time then he put his hands on her, lifted her up. Yesterday the contact would have meant nothing. Without direct intention, she came to be sitting on his knee. "Here!" He took out his handkerchief and wiped her eyes. Then he kissed her on the cheek and patted her arm, trying to feel the act as a paternal one. His authority was gone. That didn't matter. "I like that," she said. "Maybe. Now you go off and forget this ever happened." She sighed and swallowed ruefully. "My legs are wet." She pulled up the front of the pink petticoat and began to wipe her knee. He said angrily, "You know what people say of you, Demelza." She shook her head. "What?" "If you act like this, what they say of you will become true." She looked at him candidly this time, without coquetry and without fear. "I live only for you, Ross." A breeze lifted the curtain at one of the open windows. The birds outside were quiet at last, and it was dark. He kissed her again, this time on the mouth. She smiled unsteadily through the remnants of her tears, and the candlelight lent a cream gold charm to her skin. Then, by some mischance, she put up the hand to push back her hair, and the gesture reminded him of his mother. He got up, lifting her to her feet so sharply that she almost fell, went to the window, stood with his back to her. It was not the gesture, but the frock, perhaps the smell of it, something that brought up to him the taste, the flavours of yesterday. His mother had lived and breathed in that frock, in this room, in that chair. Her spirit moved and quickened between them. Ghosts and phantoms of another life. "What's to do?" she asked. He turned. She was standing at the table, holding to it, the broken glass at her feet. He tried to remember her as a thin little urchin trailing across the fields with Garrick behind her. But that was no use at all. The urchin was gone forever. It was not beauty she had grown overnight, but the appeal of youth, which was beauty in its own right. "Demelza," he said, and even her name was strange. "I didn't take you from your father what do it matter what you took me for? You don't understand," he said. "Get out! Get out!" He felt the need to soften what he said, the need to explain, but the slightest movement on his part would throw restraint away. He stared at her, and she did not speak. Perhaps she was silently admitting defeat, but he didn't know. He couldn't read her. Her eyes were the eyes of a stranger who had usurped familiar ground. They stared at him with a challenge grown faintly hostile and hurt. He said, "I'm going to bed now. You also go to bed and try to understand." He picked up one of the candles, blew out the others in that sconce. He glanced at her briefly, forced a half smile. "Good night, my dear." Still she did not speak or move. When the door closed behind him, then, at last, in the silent room, with only the frustrated moth for company, she turned and picked up the candle for herself, and one by one began to blow out the others he had left. In his bedroom he was beset by a wave of cynicism of quite surprising violence. What sort of a monk and anchorite was he becoming? Shades of his own father seemed to rise and whisper, "Young prude!" Heaven, he said to himself, what moral code had he drawn for himself that he had to obey these nice distinctions? You could fritter away a whole youth tracing the petty differences between one moral obligation and another, slender, refined Elizabeth, gaunt, lascivious Margaret, Demelza with her flowering maidenhood, a passionate child rolling in the dust with her ugly dog, a girl driving oxen, a woman. Did anything else matter? He owed no one anything, certainly not Elizabeth. She was nothing any longer to him. This was no blind seeking after sensation in order to drown a hurt, as it had been on the night of the ball. God, he had never been so drunk on so little brandy before. That old stiff silk dress, part of an older love. He sat on the bed uncertainly and tried to think. He tried to think over the incidents of the day. The beginning was frustration, and the end was frustration. Frankly, Mr. Poldark, I'm inclined to agree with my friend Dr. Holtz. It is no doubt very unfortunate that the prisoner is suffering from this disability. Who but a dolt would have expected the magistrates to do anything but agree with each other? Must back each other up, esprit de corps. Good of the community, good of the class, that was what he had ignored. One did not stand up in a witness box and argue against one's own class in public, let alone harangue them in front of a crowd of court idlers. It wasn't done. Well, he had his own standards of behaviour, though no one gave him credit for them. It was nothing out of the way for the younger gentry of the neighbourhood to tumble their kitchen maids. They didn't kidnap them when they were underage, that was all. Well, she was of age now, age enough to know her own mind, and sense enough to read his before he knew it himself. What was the matter with him? No sense of humour to leaven life? Must every act be dead serious, a weight upon his head and hands? Loving was a recreation. All the poets sang of its lightness, its levity. Only the dull clod raised barriers of creed, of conscience. There was no air tonight. The temperature didn't often keep up after dusk. At least he had in some way earned an increased gratitude of Ginny. These years would seem even longer to her than for Jim. Would he see them through? Quite the sentimental fool, egad. Quite the renegade, mixing with the Indians and fighting against the whites. Traitor to one's own station in life. Then come kiss me, sweet and beauty is but a flower which wrinkles will devour. Upsetting himself about some farm labourer with a bad cough. Rather unbalanced, one supposes. After all, one has to accept the rough with the smooth. Last year, when my prize mare took the blood poisoning, every wise man's son doth know. He got up and went to the north window to see if it was open. The sophistries of the poets. Tonight he could see nothing straight. Were sweet singers the best counsellors? Yes. The window was wide open. He pulled back the curtain and stared out. In 27 years he had worked out some sort of philosophy of behaviour. Did one throw it over at the first test? There was a tap on the door. "Come in," he said. He turned. It was Demelza, carrying a candle. She did not speak. The door swung to behind her. She hadn't changed, and her dark eyes were like lamps. "What is it?" he said. "His frock." "Well?" "The bodice unfastens down the back." "Well?" I can't reach the hooks." He frowned at her a moment. She came slowly up to him, turned, set the candle clumsily upon the table. "I'm sorry." He began to undo the dress. She felt his breath on her neck. There was still one scar of those he had seen on the way home from Redruth Fair. His hands touched the cool skin of her back. Abruptly they slipped inside her frock and closed about her waist. She leaned her head back against his shoulder, and he kissed her until the room went dark before her eyes. But now, at this last moment, when all was won, she had to confess her deceit. She couldn't die unshriven. "I lied," she whispered, crying again. "I lied about the hooks. Oh, Ross, don't take me if you hate me. I lied. I lied." He said nothing, for now nothing counted, not lies, nor poets, nor principles, nor any reservations of mind or heart. He released her, and lit another candle. That was the seduction scene between Ross and Demelza. It was from chapter 6. of Ross Poldark, and I believe it's the first book. I think it's the first book. Yes, it's from the first book.